for grabs in the period after the American Revolution. The British still had forts at Detroit, and they still had a lot of influence among the tribes because they were operating out of Canada. And the British are not even sure whether the new United States is going to stand. And they feel that if the United States goes under, they want to be able to move back into this region in force. And so the British keep telling the Indians, well, you should stand up against the United States, and we will supply you with guns and ammunition.
For 6 long years, the Shawnees and their allies kept U.S. forces on the run, all but destroying the American Army in 1792 in northern Indiana, only to be stopped 2 years later at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in northern Ohio, where a well-planned retreat to the safety of a nearby British fort was turned into a disaster for the Indian Confederacy, and a bitter lesson in British reliability that Tecumseh would never forget.
Tecumseh fights in the battle and eventually has to withdraw with part of his warriors towards the British fort. The tribal people assume that the British are going to let them into the fort and that there will be another stand made there, but the British refuse them entrance.
The British slammed the gates of the fort in their faces, fearful of a renewed war with the United States. To the Indians, to Tecumseh, this is another act of British betrayal.
Well, Fallen Timbers is a disaster for tribal people, and it is following this battle that the tribes are forced to sign the Treaty of Greenville, giving up about the southeastern 2/3 of Ohio. Tecumseh refuses to sign the treaty. He even refuses to participate in the proceedings. Tecumseh is incensed that they are forced to give up much of his former homeland. But this is the death knell in many ways for the tribes in the Old Northwest.
The natural world that the Shawnees knew was changing. Eastern tribes are being pushed farther into their lands. There are observations of deer being less, bear being less, the receding of wild game. And so Tecumseh has to construct some type of plan, and it has to be a large plan, in order to confront this huge westward expansion that begins to pulsate into different areas, into the Great Lakes area and into the southeast parts of the United States. But how do you stop this huge westward expansion?
The Treaty of Greenville marked a crucial turning point in the battle for the eastern half of the continent, opening the Ohio River Valley to a flood of white settlers, and hemming the Shawnees and their allies onto dwindling tracts of land, too small to sustain the old ways of life. Even in the newly created territory of Indiana, into which Tecumseh and his followers now retreated, hoping to find refuge, a systematic policy of land loss and dispossession was soon put into place by American politicians, eager to effect the transfer of land any way they could, and convinced the Indian way of life was dying. The American settlements will gradually circumscribe and approach the Indians, President Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1801, who will in time either incorporate with us as citizens of the United States or remove beyond the Mississippi. Some tribes are advancing, and on these, English seductions will have no effect. But the backward will yield and be thrown further back into barbarism and misery, and we shall be obliged to drive them with the beasts of the forest into the stony mountains.
I don't think we appreciate just how ruthless Thomas Jefferson was as president in 1801, and how ruthless folks like Jefferson's territorial governor, William Henry Harrison, were in the period specifically after 1800. The Americans employed what was called the factory system, and what that was the establishment of government forts throughout the Old Northwest, where the government would accept furs in exchange for goods. And it became a way of making Native people into debtors of the United States. And when Thomas Jefferson becomes president in his first term, he writes William Henry Harrison and says, essentially through the factory system, Native people will incur debts beyond what they are willing to pay, and they will only be able to pay those back through a cession of lands.
So for the Shawnees, for Tecumseh, it was a period of continual dispossession, a continual violence, and continual retreat. There is no place at that time you could really, if you were a Shawnee, have called home, because it was constantly being taken off you.
So that by 1805, Native people find themselves confined to a small corridor of land, really a spit of land, in northwestern Ohio and northeastern Indiana. That's all that's left of them. And it is not enough to continue a hunting tradition. What was happening to them was a tragedy of epic proportions. Men could no longer hunt. They could no longer operate as life-sustaining killers. They could not feed their families via hunting. They were on a constant war footing. And another horrifying aspect of it is that so many men have tried to protect their people through war and have died doing it, that these villages are totally out of balance. So that there are probably double the number of women as men in any native village in 1805 because of this war of attrition. And so these are not only broken homes, but broken communities.
It is a time in which disease flourishes and spreads across many of the tribes of the Ohio Valley. It is a time when alcoholism begins to spread among the tribe. The very fabric of tribal society, the kinship systems, seem to be under stress. And it's a time when I think a lot of Shawnees are having second thoughts about who are we and what is going on here? Why has the Master of Life turned his face from us? What has happened to us? What have we done to cause this?
By the spring of 1805, the misery and suffering in northern Indiana had reached the breaking point. In Tecumseh's village along the White River, even so great a provider as he was helpless to defend his people from the reign of woe now descending upon them. While almost day by day, his younger brother, Lalawithika, a failed hunter and warrior who had tried without success to support his family as a holy man and healer, sank further and further into an abyss of shame and despair.
I think that Lalawithika fell victim to all of the worst unintended consequences of colonialism. He was an alcoholic. Many viewed him as lazy, prone to violence. He abused his wife. And so every opportunity that Lalawithika had to distinguish himself resulted in failure. And by most accounts, he could not support his family, so that he was dependent upon Tecumseh and others like him to literally feed his family. He was so caught up in the sadness and the despair of dependency upon the United States in the form of alcohol and the fur trade, of land loss. It was so destructive and such a sad time.
It would be all the more surprising then, in the dark spring of 1805, as the universe continued to come unhinged for the Shawnees, that a message of terrifying beauty and hope would be brought to the beleaguered people, coming in their very darkest hour, and in the end, from the least likely of sources.
In 1805, his family recalls an event in which Lalawitika falls into a fire. He collapses, and everyone in his immediate family and in his immediate vicinity believes that he's dead. But he miraculously comes back to life. He wakes up to report a vision of extraordinary breadth and power.
I died and was carried in a dream by the Master of Life down into the spirit world until we came to a parting of the ways.